Hi, my name is Alsace and this is Words of Wisdom, my final project for history and literature of the Old Testament. So, the first book of wisdom that we learned about is the book of Proverbs, and we are told to approach life from the perspective of a young teacher. This teacher is full of knowledge and is able to provide insight into generally everything. And this person, at the same time, can also see what people don't. It's an invisible force called Hakma, and it essentially has this cause and effect pattern, which also leads into mortal law. And so it shows that people who interact with wisdom, which is also known as Hakma, they generally are able to build a beautiful life. And so to have true wisdom means to also have fear of the Lord in the right reasons. And at the very end, there's this collection of proverbs, which shows all aspects of life. Hakma, or wisdom, is applied to them. They are meant to guide people, and because of this, people who are wiser tend to do a lot better. But at the same time, that is argued that it is too simplistic of a perspective. So in the book of Proverbs, I picked out a couple keywords, and the first keyword that I picked out was the word Hakma. This is Hebrew for wisdom, and it's also an attribute of God that he used to create the world. And because of this, it's woven into things and their mechanisms. And so usually people that are making good decisions are ones that are tapping into Hakma versus people who are making bad decisions, they are going against Hakma. And the second word that I picked out was actually the word attribute as well. Anyone can easily access Hakma. It's an attribute of God, and like I said before, it was used to create the world, so it's woven into everything. And without this attribute, it's really hard to define that moral law. And therefore, it also makes a greater connection between God and his followers. And it basically goes to show that if you're against Hakma, you're going against God. So, what the book of Proverbs says about living wisely is generally to have true wisdom, which is that healthy respect for God, and especially regarding his definition of good and evil. We are meant to learn where that boundary is and to never cross it. We are also meant to design our life with the collection of the Proverbs in mind. Hakma is applied to them, and we are also meant to apply Hakma and find the path towards better success using those Proverbs. And like I said previously, the wise tend to do a lot better, so life works out for them. But like I mentioned previously as well, it is argued that it is too simplistic because horrible things do happen to to wise people, and at the same time, foolish people can get rewarded. So the second book of wisdom is the Ecclesiastes. And this is where we're told to view life from a middle aged critic who hears two voices. The first voice is of the critic or a teacher, and it's the main voice, but it also has really disturbing perspectives. It talks about how people are going to be forgotten because we're only blinks in time. It talks about how people share the same destiny, which is that everybody eventually passes away. But it also shows that there's a glitch in the system and how life can be really unpredictable. This is a word known as Hevel, which I will touch on later on. The second voice that he hears, though, is the voice of the author, who collects the critic's words and just summarizes them. The aim is to not hurt people, it's to humble. It's supposed to show that life has meaning and that eventually God will clear that Hevel and bring justice to the world. But it also goes to show that we are supposed to live lives in fear of the Lord and keep the commandments. So in the book of Ecclesiastes, there were two keywords that I pulled out. The first of that is the word hevel, which the critic used for a metaphor for any of the disturbing ideas that he had talked about. And this is Hebrew for vapor or smoke, and it's supposed to go to show that it is mysterious yet also stunning, just like life. And it also can transform from one shape to another, so it's not confined by one certain idea or another, it can readily change. And this is supposed to show that the meaning of life is unclear. It can be disorienting, confusing, and even uncomfortable at times. Then the second word that I chose was control. And it's supposed to show that life is unpredictable. It's hard to control. People really like being in control, and so when they don't have that control, that's when people tend to struggle the most in life. And so the book of Ecclesiastes is telling us to stop trying to control life. That's the major takeaway of it. They are trying to say to not worry about anything, to enjoy being present and spending time with loved ones, and it's supposed to keep the reader humble. So in the book of Ecclesiastes, regarding to living wisely. The critic acknowledges the Proverbs. He says that it's actually really good to learn wisdom and to stop trying to control your life. But instead, because it can be difficult, you need to control your attitude because there are things that happen that are out of our control. And to overall just try to enjoy the simple things in life. Good and bad are both really rich gifts from God, which is honestly surprising because of the previous tone of the very negative discussion over death and fate. So this wisdom is really surprising. And the author doesn't want the hope to be lost, which is why he summarizes it and wants to keep the reader humble. And he tries to show that the life actually does have meaning. The third book that we are going to talk about is the book of Job. And this is meant to be from the perspective of a weathered old man. And this is generally the story that explores the question of God's wisdom and his justification for doing things. And the story of Job essentially goes that that God is praising Job, but Satan comes and is questioning God, saying that Job is only praising him because of all the good things that he has. And so God agrees to experiment in which Job loses everything. He's absolutely heartbroken, going through this really hard time, but he still is worshiping, he's still faithful. And then eventually it does get to a point where Job accuses God and he demands an answer as to why these things are happened to him. And God does answer. He runs him through all of his really complex interactions with the universe. And it's very incomprehensible to Job because of the complexity of it. And it shows all these dynamic interactions that God has, which is showing God's wisdom. And so eventually, once he shows him all these interactions and his perspective, God eventually does double and restores Job's lost values. And so now, after seeing everything from God's perspective, Job now trusts God's wisdom through the good and the bad. So in Job, the two keywords that I pulled out were defend/defense, because God trusts Job to defend his faith. Job also defends himself when his friends are accusing him of different sins, trying to figure out why Job is being punished, seemingly at least. And then Job continues defending himself and his religion, which strengthens his religion. But eventually, this does turn into Job calling on God to defend himself, which he does. And then the second word that I picked out is perspective. Satan and God have very different perspectives about Job, which is what leads us into the story of Job. And eventually, after demanding answers from God, Job can also see from a different perspective. That's what truly builds that trust between him and God. And eventually, he's able to get everything back through God's wisdom. So, what the book of Job says about living wisely is to live in fear of the Lord and also in peace. We are told to learn to trust God through the story of Job and to show that no matter what is happening, whether it's good or bad, we can trust God. It was going to show that through those infinite interactions in the complex universe, that's where we learn God's wisdom. And so we learn to trust God and to trust his wisdom. And we further go to learn that to endure hardships with faith, humility, and trust. So the perspective that I find myself leaning more towards is the book of Ecclesiastes. And just to give a brief recap, the book of Proverbs talks about applying Hakma to your life, having a healthy respect for God, and to overall design life with Proverbs in mind. The book of Ecclesiastes talks about learning wisdom, living in fear of the Lord, not trying to control your life, staying humble, and that overall life does have meaning. And then the third book, the book of Job, talks about trusting God, his wisdom, and to endure hardships with faith. It also talks about living in peace and in fear of the Lord. So the reason why I find myself gravitating more towards the book of Ecclesiastes was because overall I enjoyed reading it. I didn't think it was also as faith focused as the other books of wisdom. And so morally, I can find myself agreeing to it a lot more than I could the other books. Bad things can absolutely happen to good people, and vice versa. And it's unfortunate to say that, but it's also a way of life. It's very realistic. It tells people to stop trying to be in control. And I find that it opens the floor to really honest conversations. They can be sad or even difficult to engage in, but ultimately it can be really healthy for a person and their soul to engage in those conversations. It helps people learn to stay present and make a good impression on the world, which I think is a very hard thing to find nowadays. So then the hardest perspective that I find myself accepting is the perspective of Job. So the reason why I struggled with this is because it was heavily centered on religion and faith. And so personally, I really struggle with that. So this was immediately the odd one out for me. I also found it frustrating that Job didn't get to know why he was being quote unquote punished, because I personally want to know the answer to everything. I would be unsatisfied with the answer, but at the same time, I would be pretty understandable. But he also lost his family, property, and generally everything of value. He got it back, but it wouldn't be the same to me. With the lost family, especially, I wouldn't be able to make new memories with them. They are lost. And so, because of this, I didn't like the experimental portion of it. I don't want to feel like I can be randomly tested at will when God should have had faith in me also in the first place, knowing that I'm faithful to Him for the right reasons. Additionally, my faith is my faith. I believe that the situation should have been gone about differently. And I didn't like how Job was seemingly punished, even though he technically wasn't being punished. I completely understand God's wisdom, and like I said, he technically wasn't punished or rewarded. But at the same time, it did come across as a punishment to Job. I feel like God should have come to him sooner to explain the reasonings why, and additionally, the video also says that we don't know why Job was given a gift, which further makes the situation more confusing because we don't understand fully, seemingly, why this happened to him. But after reading these, I do recognize that there are areas of life that I need to work on. I should probably look more into the Proverbs and Hakma. I would see them as a guiding tool. They were honestly really interesting to learn about, and I really want to see myself looking more into them going forward. I also want to live more carefree. I want to stop worrying and feeling guilty. And so maybe in the future, I could potentially work towards the idea of practicing religion. But this also has to be my own personal want, not anybody else's. This slide is the sources of the videos. This slide shows all the sources of the images that I used. And I thank you for spending your time listening to my presentation.